using a little bit of a different setup today because I just wanted to change things up. I wanted to practice filming in a different way and then also using the different microphone that I have just to see the difference and see how the video works. Today's topic, not one that I really need to demonstrate anything for. It's just going to be me talking. It's a question that I get fairly often, and that question is, should you wear wrist wraps or wrist support when you're training handstands? As always, I'm going to answer that with more questions, but the point is that you get a better idea of why you would use wrist support, why you wouldn't use it, and then what are the potential advantages, disadvantages. So first of all, understanding the difference between hand balancing practice or something like gymnastics, especially vault, where there's a lot of impact, right? So understanding this idea of impact is very important because you might see gymnasts are wearing some kind of wrist support sometimes. Usually on the vault is the most common, and it's because they hit the vault so hard with their hands. It's a massive amount of impact, and even with the wrist support, it's super rough on the wrist, right? But the difference in a hand balancing handstand is that the weight is constant. The weight is just your body. So because there's no impact, you should be able to modify the technique to not use wrist support. So if you are experiencing wrist pain, that would be always the first thing I look at is, what does your technique look like? Because it may be the way you do the handstand that's actually causing the wrist pain itself. Now, some people might see the wrist either wraps or support as a way to help recover from an injury or as a way to help allow them to train if they have stiff wrists or inflexible wrists. There's a couple disadvantages to that, specifically for the hand balancing training. One is that it's going to minimize the movement in your wrist. So if you're wrapping it or if you have some kind of artificial support, what's going to happen is your wrist won't be able to move as much. And if you watch my videos on how to balance the handstand, you'll understand that there does have to be a certain amount of stability and strength and support in the wrist. But remember that actually balancing the handstand comes from a lot of tiny wrist movements. So if your wrist is being held immobile, that's going to actually slow down your progression towards being able to balance better. And again, to use another example of an athlete that might wrap the wrist, boxers, obviously they wrap the wrist because they want zero wrist movement. They want it to be locked when they punch somebody. But as a hand balancer or as someone training the art of hand balance, you don't want your wrist to be locked because that's where most of your balance corrections come from. So that's a very important thing to understand. So using wrist support on a regular basis can offer you a big disadvantage in terms of actually learning to refine the balancing technique. The other issue is the idea of artificial support. Right, so your body is really interesting in the way that it conserves energy. So if there's a task that's being done by an outside force and your body doesn't have to do that, it's not going to. So the issue is that if you get used to wearing wrist support long term, it can actually weaken your wrist because your body understands that it doesn't have to provide that stability, through it itself. Right? So again, there are potential situations like perhaps recovering from an injury as an intermediary as a progression to not using it. But even still, for wrists, I specifically wouldn't recommend it. Again, just because you get too used to it and it's actually impeding and hindering your potential recovery process because you want that stability to be in your own body, in your own wrist. You don't want to have to rely on an external support because not only does your wrist get weaker, skill-wise, you start depending on needing to have that external support. And unless you're doing super dynamic skills where you want a bit of extra stiffness, you shouldn't need it. You shouldn't have to use it. And the other issue with the stiffness is there are ways to be able to do a handstand without putting the same pressure on your wrist, but still being able to do it without having to wear the wrist support. And that would be either practicing on parallel bars or practicing on decline blocks. So I've had a number of wrist injuries, and one of the recovery methods I've used a couple times because I had a couple injuries where it took maybe a month or two or longer until I could do handstands on the floor. but I could still do handstands on the parallel bars because I maintained a neutral wrist position, or dumbbells or something like that. So the idea is that I'm still building up the support and strength of the wrist. I'm still using that as part of an injury recovery method, but I'm not making the wrist rely on external support. I'm just practicing the skill with a wrist angle that doesn't stress the injury as much. Same thing with decline blocks. You can get them from a few different companies now, but I remember a few years ago I had this wrist injury, and the wrist injury was from tumbling, right? It was from doing some back handsprings without warming up like I should have, and I smashed the hand. So the injury itself wasn't from hand balancing, but it kind of derailed my hand balancing practice for a month or two, and that's how I worked up to being able to do a handstand on the floor again. Was first just movement, not doing handstands, then doing them on the dumbbells, then progressing to the decline blocks, and then through that progression I could get back to floor again. If I were to use the wrist support, I think it actually would have made my recovery a lot longer because, again, I know I'm repeating myself. Your body is lazy. It wants to conserve energy. So if you allow it to rely on external support, it's going to. And then long term, that will affect your practice. So it's just something to keep in mind. There's no right or wrong here. It's just good to understand the potential advantages and disadvantages for both short and long term. Now, there are situations like, for example, maybe someone gets a surgery on their knee or their ankle and they get back to training. They wear a brace to give them a bit of extra stability. And then that's a progression towards not being able or not having to use the brace. But even then, you'll see sometimes they still get reliant on it. So the goal is to get strong enough in that recovery to not need the external support. And if you do use it, you just have to be really careful with how you use it, because if you use it the wrong way, you could be building dependence on it. And that's not something you want. It's really not. Now, I will offer a solution. So I do wear these. I don't wear wrist support. I don't wrap my wrist, but if I do feel I've tweaked something, if I do feel like something's off, I'm getting a bit of pain, I do wear these little cloth wristbands. This one I got from Amazon. It doesn't matter. It's just cloth. I think it has silver embedded in the fabric or some shit, but that doesn't matter. The point is that when I wear this, it offers zero support to the joint. That's really important. So what does it do? Keeps it warm. Right, I get a lot of questions about injury recovery, and most of them I can't answer because they require a more in-depth understanding of the person asking the question than can be covered through, YouTube or Instagram comments. But one of the most general tips that I give is just warmth and blood flow, right? A warm joint works better. The more blood it gets flowing in and out of it, the better it's going to work, the faster it's going to heal because it's getting nutrients, it's circulating everything. So the wrists especially, they're far away from the heart, so they don't get as much blood flow, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the wrist, right? There's a lot of little bones, tendons, connective tissue going through a very small space. So anything that you can do to promote more blood flow is going to be massively beneficial. And this is just a really simple way to do that. So if you watch through my old videos, you'll see I don't train with this all the time, but I did have a lot of moments where I was training on a regular basis wearing the wrist wraps. Why? Because it just keeps the wrist warm. And I know personally, I already don't have the best circulation to my hands. Like in the winter, my hands get real cold really easily. So it's just something that gives a little bit of extra heat, a little bit of extra blood flow. And don't be afraid, like if you're recovering from an injury, don't be afraid to just wear this all the time for a few days in a row, even sleeping in it. If you do wear it long term like that, especially if you do sleep in it, just make sure that it doesn't have any compressive properties. So if it's one of those like compression wraps, that could cut off the blood flow and you could wake up with your hand going numb. So yeah, that's just any kind of cloth wristbands I do recommend, because it's not supporting the joint. You have to provide your own support, but it is enhancing the blood flow that it's going to get, and more blood flow is in general something that's a very good thing, except in a couple of situations. So those are my thoughts on whether or not you should use wrist support in hand balancing. If you just skipped through the end, too long didn't watch, no, you shouldn't. Athletes will use wrist support for a number of instances, but usually it's when it involves a lot of impact to the wrist where you want it to be stiff. In hand balancing, you don't want the wrist to be stiff. You want it to support your weight, but you want to understand the weight distribution, and you have to do these little hand movements to balance and to manipulate that weight distribution. And if your wrist is stiff, it's going to slow down your progression of learning how to balance, and it can potentially build a dependence on the artificial support, and it can make the joint weaker over the long term because of that dependence built on the artificial support. So stay away from artificial support. Ideal case, you work your technique to the point that it doesn't take a lot of physical effort to do the handstand. You work your alignment to the point that it doesn't stress your body to stay in the position. That takes a little bit of time, depending. Some people pick it up faster than others, but that's number one. And then if you do get a tweak, if your wrists do feel off, just get some cloth wristbands and wear them when you train or wear them throughout the day, and that should help. So, as always, let me know if you enjoyed this video, let me know your thoughts on wrist support, and let me know what else you'd like to see on this channel.